there's a book that was published a couple of years ago. I think it's called The Reviled Mr. Lincoln. And it makes the author is a well-known historian. He makes the case that Lincoln was the most hated president in all of American history. Of all the presidents we've had during his lifetime, he was hated, and it's not hard to understand, and not by the people of the South. Of course, that's assumed they hated him, but the people of the North who voted for him, because he suspended habeas corpus and mass arrested thousands of northern civilians. He shut down hundreds of opposition newspapers in the northern states. He deported a member of Congress from Ohio, from Dayton, Ohio, named Clement Vallandigham. And so you'd expect that a lot of people in the northern states really disliked, if not hated him. But that was all changed after the war. It was sort of a big propaganda campaign by the Republican Party, and with the help of the New England clergy, for the most part, that turned him into a secular saint. And I think you have to understand that America went from a republic to an empire after the Civil War. You know, it would have been unthinkable for Jefferson and people of that ilk to get involved in the Spanish-American War in the late 19th century, for example. And Abe Lincoln became the face not of the constitutional republic of the founders, but of the American empire. And so I think they took it from there. Politicians of all parties deified Lincoln because they thought that would deify the state in general and would justify, whatever they wanted to do.
Did Lincoln at any time express any believable regret for the actions that he took that gave us the Civil War and the death of hundreds of thousands of Americans? Did he ever recant any of that?
Well, not that I know of. As I've written, you've probably read my writings quite a bit, that his biggest failure, in my view, was that all the rest of the world ended slavery peacefully through some sort of compensated emancipation, and the British just bought up all the slaves and set them free. And actually, Ron Paul himself said that when he was asked about this on MSNBC a couple of years ago. But Lincoln used the slaves as political pawns in a war that was about consolidating all political power in Washington, D.C., in my view. And so, yes, his actions did result in the ending of slavery, but I'm convinced that we could have done it like the rest of the world did, like the British, the French, the Spaniards, the Danes, the Swedes. They all ended slavery peacefully. And that includes people of Ohio, by the way, and people of New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. There were no wars of emancipation in those places, but there were slaves in every state. Ulysses S. Grant was actually an overseer in his father-in-law's slave plantation before the Civil War. And so, but there were no wars of emancipation anywhere else but here in America during that time. And I don't know that Lincoln ever recanted or apologized for a death. And the death count, by the way, the latest historical researchers think that it may have been more like 800,000 dead Americans in the Civil War. And if you standardize that for today's much larger population, that would be the equivalent of 8 million Americans dying in 4 years.
Well, as catastrophic as that was, I believe, of course, it's been a while, and you and I pretty much had the same education, the same myths and all the rest. But the idea was that Lincoln freed the slaves. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, and the South got pissed off and started the Civil War.
Well, you had even a worse education than I did.
Until I read the real Lincoln. Yeah.
Well, first of all, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to what it called rebel territory, which is where the U.S. Army had no power to free anybody. Early in the war, a couple of Lincoln's generals, one of them named Fremont, another named Hunter, actually took the bull by the horns and issued their own local proclamations in Missouri and Georgia and said, we're going to free the slaves. And Lincoln rescinded their orders and fired them. He stripped them of their commands. And so when I was at Springfield, Illinois, a couple of years ago at the Lincoln Presidential Museum, they had a video of the face of a former slave and a read-over of his words, mocking Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, because this man knew that it didn't free him. He knew that such a thing existed during his time, but it didn't free him because he was not behind rebel lines at the time. And the actual proclamation was excoriated by the media in America and in Europe by being a political gimmick, and it was called a war proclamation by Lincoln, which meant if the war ended the next day, it would have become defunct. It would have had no power, no influence. And of course, slavery was ended by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in January 1st of 1866, not the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, well, you're right. I was in public school for all of that. Not since back then. I got into prep school. The question, and I know that we tend to eschew hypotheticals and all the rest of that, but especially considering that you're an economist, you're up there with Walter and Lou and Stephen and so on. Could you give us what would have happened if the South had successfully seceded from the Union, and Jefferson Davis went on and so on. The country's certainly big enough. They were agricultural. The Northeast was industrial. Would there have been peaceful coexistence and everybody would have gotten along just fine and done swell?
Well, I think so. I think, as you know, Brian, in my writings, I argued that, we should have done what the rest of the world did first and ended slavery peacefully, and like everyone else, including the northern states did. And then, Thomas Jefferson himself was asked by friends in the 1820s, shortly before he died, what would happen if there was a breakup of the Union and several sections seceded, which was being widely discussed at the time. The New England Federalists plotted for over 10 years to secede from the Union and create their own country in New England after Jefferson was elected. And Jefferson's response, he said that they will all be our children, and those are his words, our children, and we would wish them all well. And so he said they would all be Americans, and they would just be from different regions. But he, of course, thought that a government that big, all of, the big chunk of North America that we take up would be totally impractical and would lead to a tyranny and ungovernable, which is it turned out to be true. And so sure, if we could have all these allies that we have so-called to wage all these wars that we're involved in constantly, why couldn't people from, say, Virginia be allied with people from Pennsylvania in whatever endeavor we might be allied with? It's preposterous to think that would not have worked out, and we would have traded with everyone. Both sides would have traded, and we might have reunited in the future. Who knows? The whole purpose of secession, by the way, in the eyes of people like Jefferson, was not necessarily to break up the Union if it didn't behave, but to pose as a threat to the government in Washington. That if they did not abide by the Constitution, then the Union would be broken up. And the thinking was that, that will discipline members of Congress. That will force them to propose only laws that are constitutional. Otherwise, they will be responsible for the breakup of the Union. But that all ended during the Civil War, of course, because the Lincoln administration proved that the Union, if you try to secede over constitutional issues, we will shoot you. And we've got the gunpowder and the size of an army to enforce that.
Yes, I suppose, I think we've had this conversation down in Columbus. There was a show that I did with Walter somewhere, and he was kind of talking about the idea what would happen if a governor came along that had the chutzpah to say, forget it, and he cited Texas because apparently the Texas Constitution has a provision that if they don't like what's going on in Washington, they still retain the opportunity to pull out, and they're big enough and diversified enough in so many different ways to be able to be self-sustaining. When you look at the economic situation that the country is in now, with huge entitlement deficits and things, and and all these different programs and so on. What do you think? I don't want to put on the tinfoil hat, but you think that might be a really great idea? I know they're trying it up in New Hampshire with the Free State Project. Do you think that that could ever come off?
I don't know, but I think it could. The Soviet Union broke up through over a dozen acts of peaceful secession. So, whoever thought that would happen in 1988, 89. So, if it could happen in the Soviet Union, it could happen here. And the way I look at it is, thank God for the people who were enslaved by the Soviet Empire that they had Mikhail Gorbachev and not Abraham Lincoln as the head of their government. Because, Lincoln would have invaded and murdered them by the hundreds of thousands as he did to Southerners who tried to secede. But my old friend Yuri Maltsev, who you may have run across at some point,
yes.
Who was a Russian immigrant, I asked him, how did this happen? Why did Gorbachev allow this to happen? And Yuri, who lived like the first 40 years or so of his life in Russia, he said, Gorbachev just didn't have the stomach for all the violence that his predecessors had. And so I guess if we had a president who was more like Gorbachev and less like Lincoln, you could see it happen. And, the original idea of the union, even in the public schools, I was taught that it was a voluntary union, that the states voted whether to join or not to join. And it's incomprehensible that they would have just fought a revolution against a despotic, monopolistic government, the King of England, and then turned around and created the same kind of system, from which there could never be any escape. But that was Lincoln's theory, that there could never be any escape under any circumstances, and he was willing to use the full force of the U.S. military to prove him right. But that was then, and I think Gorbachev showed the way in terms of allowing peaceful secession, and I think I'm a little optimistic that it could happen here. I hope it does.
Yeah, I think that would be swell, although I'm afraid we got another Lincoln that's in the White House right now, and some of the things that... Yeah, that's not good. We'll have to get together and talk about that again. I've been remiss in having you here on the show as often as I should, Tom, and I apologize for that. But if your class schedule will allow, we'll change that immediately.
Sure thing. I forgive you.
You're gonna put one of those up on your website like Walter Williams has the great forgiveness
proclamation of forgiveness. Yeah,
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah. I look forward to that. Tom, thanks a lot. Say hello to your bride. We'll talk again real soon. Appreciate it very much.
Brian.
Thank you, sir. Tom DiLorenzo, professor of economics and writer extraordinaire. If you haven't read The Real Lincoln, it's not real long, but it'll have a long-term effect on the way you look at American history.